41 people were already inside the Caldwell Towers Penthouse ballroom when the elevator doors opened and Chris Hemsworth stepped out wearing a faded gray Henley, dark jeans with a frayed left knee, and boots that had seen at least 3 countries. The champagne conversations didn't stop. Nobody looked up from their catalog paddles. But the woman at the registration table, Diane Hargrove, co-chair of the Hargrove Foundation's annual charity auction, looked up immediately. And then she looked twice. He walked in like he owned the place. That was the problem. Not the clothes, not the boots, the walk. The way his eyes moved across the room in a single slow sweep, landing on nothing in particular, missing nothing at all, like someone doing a quiet inventory of something that already belonged to them. His gaze settled briefly on the northeast corner of the ceiling, a specific panel where the acoustic dampening met the glass curtain wall, and something in his expression suggested he was not seeing it for the first time. Diane set down her champagne flute with a soft click and smoothed the front of her gown. In her 22 years of chairing Chicago's most exclusive philanthropic events, she had developed what she considered an infallible social radar. Old money moved quietly. New money moved loudly. People who didn't belong at all moved exactly like that. Too calm, too unhurried, carrying the particular ease of someone who had nothing to lose because they had never had anything to protect. She crossed the marble floor toward him before he reached the cocktail tables. "Excuse me." Her voice was warm in the way that expensive knives are warm. The temperature of the handle, not the blade. "Are you a registered guest this evening?" The man turned. He had the kind of face that made you look again, not because of anything theatrical, but because of something quieter than that. Steady eyes. A half smile that suggested he'd heard more interesting questions. "I should be on the list," he said. The accent was soft Australian. Chris Hemsworth. Diane consulted her clipboard with the focused precision of someone who had already made up her mind. She ran her finger down the page. Then she ran it down again. "I'm not seeing that name. Could be under the foundation. Center Wellness Foundation." He leaned forward slightly to look, which was polite. It was also unnecessary, and they both knew it. "I'm afraid not." Diane straightened and let the clipboard fall to her side. Her smile hadn't moved. "Sir, this is a private event. Invitations were issued by the Hargrove Foundation Board. If you've somehow received incorrect information about tonight, I'm sure there's been a clerical error somewhere, but I can't admit unregistered guests." "Of course." He nodded slowly, looked around the room once more, that same unhurried inventory, then took a single step back toward the elevator. He wasn't arguing, wasn't searching his phone to show a confirmation email. He just looked at the room the way you look at something you'll be seeing again later. Diane watched him for a moment. Something about his calmness irritated her in a way she couldn't precisely name. "Is there someone I can call for you?" The offer was not generous. It was a closing of a door. "No need," he said. "Thank you." He didn't leave. He moved instead to the far end of the cocktail terrace, a semicircular space of floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked Lake Michigan 41 floors below, and picked up a sparkling water from a passing server's tray with a small nod of thanks. He stood at the railing and looked out at the water. Then, without looking down, he reached behind him and adjusted the position of a nearby bar stool by 2 inches so a server carrying a full tray could pass without having to pivot. He didn't look at the server. The server looked at him. Diane watched him from across the room. He was still there. That was the problem. The head caterer's name was Sandra Yates. She had worked 41 floors of corporate events and charity galas in Chicago for 19 years, and she had the specific quality of stillness that develops in people who have learned to read rooms faster than rooms can read them. When the elevator had opened and the man in the faded Henley had stepped out, Sandra had gone very still behind the champagne station. She leaned toward the young server beside her, a 23-year-old named Owen Parker, who had worked exactly 11 events at the Caldwell. "Owen," she said quietly, "keep pouring. Don't look at the man at the glass railing. The one who, yes, that one. He doesn't look like he's supposed to be here. He looks exactly like he's supposed to be here." Sandra kept her voice flat and professional. "You are going to treat him exactly the same way you treat every other guest in this room. Better, if anything. You do not go to Mrs. Hargrove. You do not say his name. You understand?" Owen didn't understand, but he nodded. Sandra crossed to the service corridor and pulled out her personal phone. Her hands were steady. She had been in this industry long enough to know that the most consequential moments at high-end events were not the loud ones. They were the quiet ones. The ones where someone powerful decided to see what a room looked like when it believed nobody important was watching. She typed a message and waited. The response came in 40 seconds. She read it, put her phone away, and went back to her station. She looked once at the man standing at the glass railing, this quiet, large, unhurried man in worn boots who had just reorganized the bar area without being asked, and then she looked at Diane Hargrove moving through the room with the precision of a woman who believed the most important decision she would make tonight was the seating chart. Sandra Yates had been doing this long enough to know how this kind of evening ended. She just didn't know yet how badly. The auction was scheduled to begin at 8. By 7:40, the ballroom had filled to its capacity of 63 guests. Chicago's philanthropic establishment, old steel money, new tech money, the kind of real estate wealth that expressed itself in understated Swiss timepieces and two-sentence bios. The Hargrove Foundation's annual auction raised between $4 and $7 million for pediatric cancer research at Northwestern Memorial, depending on the year. It was a good cause. Nobody at this event would have denied that. But let me tell you what else was true about the Hargrove Foundation in the autumn of that year. Because this story isn't just about one evening. Diane Hargrove ran the foundation's events division with absolute authority, and she ran it well in the ways that were visible. Tables filled, paddles lifted, checks cleared. But there was a second set of books kept in the foundation's social ledger, not financial, nothing that would interest a regulator, but real nonetheless. A record of who was welcomed and who was managed, who was deferred to and who was redirected, who belonged in Diane's specific and unexamined taxonomy of belonging, and who did not. Most of the staff knew this record existed. None of them had ever found a way to dispute it. Clifford Hargrove, Diane's husband, chairman of the foundation's board, a man whose family had endowed the organization's operating fund, had signed the venue agreement with Caldwell Tower Management 18 months earlier. He had signed it because the event licensing fee was favorable and the Penthouse floor was prestigious. He had not read the agreement closely enough to notice the name of the company he was contracting with. Diane had not read it at all. This was the thing that would matter later. She approached Chris again at 7:45 with a different quality of attention. The warm knife politeness from the registration desk was gone. This was something more direct. "I thought we had cleared this up," she said. He turned from the window. "I've been enjoying the view. This is a registered event with ticketed admission. I'm going to need you to leave before the program begins." "Is there a reason I can't stand here?" "Yes. You're not a registered guest." "I was told my registration may have gone through a different channel." He was completely calm. Not the manufactured calm of someone suppressing anger, something older than that. The calm of someone who has decided not to hurry. "Is there someone I could speak to about confirming that?" "I am the person to speak to." Diane's voice lifted slightly. Nearby guests were beginning to drift toward the edges of nearby conversations. "I'm the co-chair of this event, and I can tell you categorically that your name is not on any list associated with this evening." "All right." He didn't move. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to the register that combined the appearance of discretion with the effect of a public announcement. "I don't know what you were hoping to accomplish by coming here tonight, but this is not an event where you can simply walk in off the street." Her eyes moved very briefly down and back up. "Our guests contribute at an average of $40,000 per table. I'd hate for you to be embarrassed by a paddle situation." Something crossed his face. Not offense. Something quieter than that. He looked at her for a moment in the specific way that someone looks at a thing they intend to remember accurately. "I appreciate your concern," he said. "I'm going to ask one more time." She straightened. "Please leave voluntarily, or I'll need to involve security." 3 people within earshot had stopped pretending to have other conversations. "I'll stay," he said simply. The security manager's name was Dave Fitch. He was 51 years old and had worked building security at the Caldwell Tower for 6 years. And one of the things he had learned in those 6 years was the specific value of taking an extra 60 seconds before doing anything irreversible. When Diane summoned him, he walked over at his normal measured pace. He looked at Chris Hemsworth. He looked at Diane. He looked at the service corridor where he knew Sandra Yates was listening. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said carefully, "could I have a moment with you first?" "It's a trespasser, Dave. It doesn't require a moment." "In this specific situation, I believe it does." Diane turned to face him with the expression of a woman whose patience had spent decades developing load-bearing walls. "Fine, make it quick." He leaned close and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "Ma'am, I made a call about this guest. I'd strongly advise you to delay any action until after the program. Strongly advise." She repeated the words with the careful neutrality of someone deciding whether to be offended. "Dave, I have 63 guests watching a scene unfold in the corner of my auction." "I understand. Then stop advising me and do your job." Dave Fitch was quiet for a moment. He looked at the man standing at the glass railing. This man who had, without any drama, correctly identified by touch the exact point where the terrace railing's mounting had shifted 3 millimeters since installation, running one finger along the seam the way you run a finger along something you remember building. Dave had noticed that. He doubted Diane had. "Yes, ma'am," he said. But he didn't move. And here's the thing that matters. In the next 2 minutes, 3 different staff members found reasons to cross the terrace near where Chris was standing. A server refreshing his water. Owen Parker repositioning a cocktail table that didn't need repositioning. Sandra Yates herself, carrying a tray she had no reason to carry to that end of the room. Each of them made brief, deliberate eye contact with him. Each of them gave the smallest possible nod. Not conspiratorial. Something simpler than that. The acknowledgement you give someone when you want them to know they are seen. Diane watched all of this and could not name what she was watching. "Dave." Her voice had gone flat. "Remove him now or I'm calling your supervisor." "Go ahead and call him," Dave said. "I'll hold." The silence after that sentence lasted 4 seconds. Long enough for 2 nearby guests to exchange a glance. Diane chose not to make the call, but she was not finished. She stepped away from Dave and pulled out her phone. She moved to the far side of the reception area, just out of earshot of the nearest guests, and dialed. Her husband picked up on the second ring. "Clifford, we have a problem." Her voice was low, efficient, the tone she used when she needed him to act rather than ask questions. "There's a man here who refuses to leave. He has no registration, no invitation, and he's been disrupting staff all evening. I need you to call building management and have them formally suspend his access tonight. And I need you to contact Gerald Ashworth and make sure he understands we may be looking at a threat to the event license." A pause. "Yes, tonight. The auction's still running. Do it now." She hung up and walked back toward the ballroom with the steady pace of a woman who had just applied the correct pressure to the correct point. She did not know that she had just called her husband about a man whose company her husband had signed a contract with 18 months ago. She did not know that building management reported to that same man. She did not know any of this. She was at this moment the most confident she had felt all evening. That was the 3rd step. And it was the one that made everything that came next inevitable. The auction ran from 8:15 to 9:47. $4,230,000 raised. Robert Callahan at the podium, silver-haired and authoritative, his voice trained by 30 years of Chicago charity events. Paddles lifted, numbers called. The visible machinery of generosity in motion. Chris Hemsworth watched from a service chair near the back wall. He had settled into it with the particular economy of someone accustomed to waiting in uncomfortable positions. Not unhappy about it, not performing patience, just genuinely at rest. He watched the auction the way you watch something that belongs to you partly, not the event, but the room. The way the acoustics caught the auctioneer's voice and distributed it evenly across 63 tables. The way the Florida sailing glass held Lake Michigan in the frame like a painting commissioned specifically for this space. He had commissioned it specifically for this space. He knew, because he had been in the planning meetings, that the acoustic dampening on the northeast ceiling panel had been installed at his personal request after the first test event produced an echo at the back tables. He knew that the curvature of the terrace glass had been redesigned twice before it achieved the angle that caught the sunset over the lake at exactly the right hour. He knew that the building had taken 3 years and $412 million to complete, and he knew the name of every lead architect and every structural engineer who had put their work into it. He sat in the back and watched the auction, and he did not say any of this to anyone. Diane, accepting her small bouquet at the podium during the closing remarks, did not look in his direction once. What she did not know was that her husband's phone calls had already come in, to building management, to Gerald Ashworth, to 3 other contacts whose numbers Clifford kept for situations requiring quiet pressure. Each of those calls had been logged. Each had been routed eventually to the same desk. And at that desk, a composed woman named Janet Lowe, who managed Thematic Capital's Chicago interests, had read the call summaries, looked at the timestamp, and reached for her own phone. She was in the elevator on her way up when Robert Callahan announced the final total. That would change everything about how this evening ended. He had been 24 years old when his mother called him from Byron Bay to tell him his father had been turned away from a restaurant. Not a grand place. A mid-range steakhouse off the Pacific Highway, the kind that had laminated menus and a lunch special board. His father had been wearing work clothes, the kind that don't wash out entirely, the kind that announce a day's labor before you open your mouth. The manager had looked at him and made a calculation in under 2 seconds, and the calculation had come out wrong. And his father had been told politely that they weren't taking walk-ins. His father hadn't argued. That was the part that stayed. He had simply turned around and walked back to his car and driven home and eaten at the kitchen table and not said a word about it until Chris's mother asked. And even then he had said it in the flat, contained tone of a person of fact they've already filed under things that happen to people like us. Chris had been a working actor then. Home and away, morning call times, the low-grade financial uncertainty of Australian television. He had sat on the floor of his apartment after that phone call and felt something clarify inside him. Not anger, not exactly, but something more durable than anger. A decision. If he ever built anything, it would not have a door where that calculation happened. 17 years later, he sat in a service chair in a building he had built, watching a charity auction raise money for sick children. And he thought about his father eating alone at a kitchen table, and he said nothing to anyone. He was good at saying nothing. The boots he was wearing were the same pair he had owned for 9 years. He had had them resoled twice. He had no intention of replacing them. The applause for the final total was still warm in the air when Janet Lowe walked into the ballroom. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had delivered difficult information before and understood that speed and composure were not opposites. She located Dave Fitch first, exchanged 4 words with him, and then crossed toward Diane Hargrove, who was still accepting congratulations near the podium, her bouquet in her hands, surrounded by the last cluster of major donors. Robert Callahan was still at the microphone stand gathering his notes. 41 guests remained in the room, coats on some shoulders, paddles tucked under arms, the slow, satisfied drift toward the exit not yet complete. Janet Lowe stopped 3 feet from Diane and spoke at a volume that was precisely public. Mrs. Hargrove, I'm Janet Lowe, Senior Counsel for Thematic Capital Group. I need a few minutes of your time regarding the venue agreement and several phone calls placed this evening by your husband. The donors around Diane went quiet. Robert Callahan looked up from his notes. I'm sorry. Diane's voice was steady but only just. This isn't the time for. The calls were logged at 8:42, 8:51, and 9:09 this evening. Janet Lowe did not raise her voice. She did not need to. In those calls, Mr. Hargrove attempted to pressure Caldwell Tower Management, the foundation's event licensing coordinator, and a board contact to remove a guest and terminate his building access. That guest is Christopher Hemsworth, the registered owner of this building and the counterparty on your foundation's event license. She paused. One breath. I thought you want to know what actions had been taken in your name before you left for the evening. 3 donors exchanged a glance. One reached for his wife's arm. Diane stood very still, the bouquet in her hands, while the sentence reorganized everything she thought she understood about the last 2 hours. Robert Callahan set down his notes. Dave Fitch moved to stand at a quiet but deliberate distance, close enough to be present, far enough to be professional. And Chris Hemsworth, from his service chair at the back of the room, watched the moment arrive. He did not stand. He did not move toward the center of it. He let it be what it was, not a victory, not a punishment. Just the truth finally occupying the space it had always been owed. Diane turned slowly and looked across the room at him. He met her eyes. He said nothing. That silence was the most complete thing either of them had said all evening. The donors filed out over the following 20 minutes. Some paused to speak to Janet Lowe in quiet, careful voices. Some did not. Robert Callahan left without another word, which said something. The room did not empty with the warm, satisfied drift of a successful event. It emptied the way rooms empty when something important has just happened, and everyone is still deciding how they feel about having been present for it. Dave Fitch intercepted Diane near the coat check. "Mrs. Hargrove, we need to talk about the full picture before you leave." She let him talk. She stood with her bouquet hanging at her side and listened to the rest of it. The ownership structure, the licensing agreement Clifford had signed, the calls logged, the position those calls had now placed both her and her husband in. Dave's voice was professional and even the voice of a man reporting facts rather than delivering a verdict. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "And you knew this when I asked you to remove him," she said. "I confirmed it on the phone call. I told you twice the situation was more complex than it appeared. I told you I needed more time." He met her eyes. "You made a decision." She didn't argue with that. He was alone at the window again when she crossed the room toward him. The lake was dark below, the city's lights scattered across it in patterns that changed every minute and had no interest in being predicted. He turned before she reached him. He had probably seen her coming from the moment she left Dave Fitch. "Mrs. Hargrove." She stopped. She had been composing sentences for the 90-second walk across the ballroom. Careful sentences, the kind that distribute responsibility evenly across a misunderstanding. She had drafts ready, good ones, reasonable ones. She looked at him and every draft dissolved. "I owe you an apology," she said. He waited. No reassurance offered, no social cushioning. He just waited, which was both harder and kinder than the alternative. "I treated you as someone who didn't belong here. I said it in front of people. I made assumptions I had no right to make about who you were, about what you deserved." She stopped. Then I made phone calls to have you removed from your own building. That was," she couldn't find the word that was large enough. "I'm sorry." The fourth paragraph of her resignation letter, the one she would rewrite 7 times and send anyway, would describe this moment. It would say, "I stood in front of the man I had spent 4 hours dismissing, and I could not find a single sentence that adequately described what I had done. That inability was, I think, the beginning of understanding it. You made the assumptions in about 2 seconds," he said. His voice wasn't cruel. It was precise. "Yes, that's usually how long it takes." She looked at him directly. "Why didn't you say who you were?" "You could have ended it immediately." He looked out at the lake for a moment. "Because I wanted to see what the room looked like when it thought nobody important was watching." A pause. "And I learned something." "What did you learn?" "Some things I already expected." His eyes came back to hers. "Some things that were worse, and some things that were better than I had any right to hope for." "Sandra," she said quietly. "Sandra, Owen, Dave, eventually." He turned slightly toward the window. "Your organization raised $4 million tonight for children who are sick. That's real. That matters. The cause is genuine, Mrs. Hargrove. What I'm less certain about is whether the organization running it understands what it's asking of the people who work to make it happen." The sentence landed without performance. No edge, no satisfaction, just the weight of what it was. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends on your board." He turned back to face her fully. "I have some thoughts about that. But not tonight." What happened next unfolded across 4 weeks, and it began not with a grand gesture, but with a phone call Diane made to her husband at 11:15 that same evening. The drive home from the Caldwell Tower. The city lights passing through the car window, Clifford picking up on the first ring this time. She told him everything Janet Lowe had told her. She told it straight, without softening it, without the careful reframings she had spent 22 years learning to apply. When she finished, Clifford was quiet for a long time on his end. Then he said, "I didn't read the contract carefully enough." "No," she said. "You didn't." Another silence. "Neither did I," she said, "read anything carefully enough." For a long time. It began 3 days after that, when a former event coordinator named Renee Colton contacted Thematic Capital's Chicago office. Renee had worked for the Hargrove Foundation for 4 years before being dismissed 18 months earlier. The stated reason in her termination letter was performance-related restructuring. The actual reason, which 3 people knew and which Renee had been persuaded it was not worth fighting, was that she had pushed back on Diane's decision to turn away a volunteer group from a South Side community organization because their presence, in Diane's assessment, would make certain major donors uncomfortable. Renee had said in a staff meeting that this was not consistent with the foundation's stated values. She had been gone by the end of that week. When Thematic Capital's legal team reached out to hear her account, Renee spoke for 2 hours. She named dates, meeting rooms, exact phrases. She had kept notes, carefully, privately, the way you keep notes when you suspect they will matter eventually but cannot afford to say so out loud. The second person to come forward was a former major donor named Wallace Briggs, who had withdrawn his annual pledge of $120,000 14 months ago after witnessing Diane redirect a middle-aged man in casual clothing from the foundation's public reception desk to the service entrance. Not because the man was a vendor or a contractor, but because his clothes suggested he might be one. Wallace Briggs had not said anything at the time. He said so now, and he named it clearly. He had not said anything because it had been easier not to. He said that had been a failure of his own, not just Diane's. He said this in writing, which was unusual for someone who had nothing to gain from it. The third account came from a member of the catering staff who had worked 6 foundation events over 2 years. A 31-year-old named Marcus Webb, who had watched Diane speak to a bus driver delivering auction items as though the man were a problem to be solved rather than a person doing a job. Marcus Webb had told no one at the time because he needed the shifts. He came forward now because someone had finally asked. These 3 accounts, the fired coordinator, the withdrawn donor, the invisible worker, were presented to the Hargrove Foundation's board in a documented summary prepared by Thematic Capital's legal counsel on a Wednesday morning at 9 a.m., 26 days after the auction. Clifford Hargrove, chairman, sat at the head of the table and read the document for 11 minutes without speaking. Then he looked at Janet Lowe across the table and said, "What are you asking for?" Janet Lowe said, "We're not asking for anything, Mr. Hargrove. We're informing you. What you do with the information is your board's decision." Clifford resigned as board chairman 4 days later, effective immediately, forfeiting his remaining term. His letter cited personal accountability for organizational failures that had occurred under his governance. The foundation's operating fund, which his family had endowed, remained in place. The children at Northwestern Memorial were not responsible for the governance failures of the adults who ran the organization in their name. Diane stepped down from her co-chair position the same day. Her resignation letter was 4 paragraphs. The first 3 were composed. The 4th was not composed at all, and it was the one that mattered. The Hargrove Foundation issued a public statement on a Thursday acknowledging leadership failures and committing to a governance review. The Chicago Tribune's philanthropy correspondent ran a piece the following Monday under the headline, "Foundation reckons with culture concerns after leadership shakeup. 14 months of complaints. 1 quiet investigation." 47,000 people read it by the end of the week. The foundation's event licensing agreement with Caldwell Tower was placed under formal review, a process that, under the terms of the original contract, Thematic Capital had the right to initiate upon documented evidence of conduct inconsistent with the building's hospitality standards. Gerald Ashworth, the board contact Clifford had called the night of the auction, quietly stepped back from his advisory role before he could be asked to. 3 major donors who had quietly reduced their pledges in the preceding 2 years restored them. 2 who had never reduced their pledges withdrew them. 3 weeks after the board meeting, a proposal arrived addressed to the interim board chair, copied to Diane Hargrove by name. It was an offer to establish a joint initiative between the foundation and Caldwell Tower Management, a 12-month paid apprenticeship program in event management, catering, and facilities administration for young adults from underserved communities on Chicago's South and West Sides. Full benefits, senior staff mentorship, a pathway to permanent placement. The program was to be called the Open Door Initiative. At the bottom of the proposal, below the legal language and the contact information, there was a single handwritten line in blue pen. It read, "The room should look the same to everyone who walks into it. That's the only architecture that matters." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Diane sat with the letter for a long time at her kitchen table. Then she picked up the phone and called the interim board chair and said, "I want to be involved in this, not as a chair, as a volunteer if they'll have me. I want to do the work, not run the work." The interim board chair, a practical woman named Gloria Stern, who had been cleaning up institutional messes for 30 years, said, "I'll ask." The answer came back yes. Owen Parker put in his application for the Open Door Initiative's first cohort on a Tuesday evening after his shift. Sandra Yates wrote his recommendation letter. She described him as someone who paid careful attention to what was happening in a room even when he was pretending not to, and who had understood, without being told, that the most important thing you can do in a professional setting is treat every person the same way, regardless of what you think you know about them. She wrote that he had learned this on a single evening in November, watching someone demonstrate it under considerable pressure, and that it had stayed with him. Owen got in. He started in January. Dave Fitch kept his job. He received a written commendation from Thematic Capital's Property Management Office. One paragraph, matter of fact. He filed it in the same drawer as his building access protocols and his emergency procedures binder. He didn't show it to anyone. He thought about it sometimes, though. The way the whole evening had turned on 60 extra seconds and a decision not to hurry. It seemed worth thinking about. In a boxing gym with no sign outside on the ground floor of a warehouse near the Chicago River, Chris Hemsworth was 3 rounds into a sparring session with a trainer who had been told once that his client preferred not to be handled carefully and had honored that preference ever since. His phone was across the room in his jacket. He didn't know yet about the Tribune piece or the donor restorations or the Open Door Initiative's approved budget. He would read about all of it later, on a first-class flight back to Byron Bay, and he would feel something that wasn't quite satisfaction, something quieter and more durable, the particular feeling of a thing having been set in motion that will continue without you. But that was later. Right now, he was hitting the bag with the economy of someone who learned how to fight, before he learned how to perform fighting. Something that started in a backyard in Byron Bay at 16. Refined in gyms that didn't care who he was and wouldn't have treated him differently if they had. His trainer called time. Chris caught the bag, steadied it, stepped back. He was breathing hard in the specific, honest way of someone who has done something real. "Good," the trainer said. Just that. Chris reached for his water. Then he held the gym door open for a maintenance worker who was coming in with a mop and a bucket. He didn't think about it. He just did it, the way you do things that have become part of your shape rather than your decisions. He waited until the man was through, gave a small nod, and let the door close behind them both. The maintenance worker said thanks. Chris said no problem. Neither of them knew the other's name. That was fine. That was the point. There is one more thing worth knowing about Sandra Yates. She had worked 41 floors of Chicago events for 19 years. She had worked for difficult clients and generous ones, for organizations that treated their staff like furniture and organizations that remembered her name at the end of the night. She had developed over those 19 years a precise internal taxonomy of which kind she was working for within the first 20 minutes of any event. She had known about the Hargrove Foundation within 15 minutes of her first event for them, 3 years earlier. She had said nothing, the way you say nothing when the alternative is losing the contract and you have staff members whose rent you feel responsible for. She had not said anything until someone asked. When Janet Lowe called her the week after the auction, Sandra answered every question she was asked. She named dates and room numbers and exact words. She had kept her own notes in a small notebook she carried in her apron pocket, the habit she had developed early in her career after the first time she had needed to remember something precisely and found she couldn't. After the call, she put the notebook in a drawer. She did not think she would need it again. She went back to work. On the first day of the Open Initiative's inaugural cohort, Sandra Yates stood in front of 12 young adults from the south and west sides of Chicago. 12 people who had never worked in event management, who were starting from nothing, who had gotten here through an application process that had asked nothing about their background and everything about their attention and their care. And she told them the one thing she had learned that she considered worth passing on. She said, "The most important skill in this industry is not the technical one. It's not the timing or the plating or the floor management. It's the habit of treating every single person who walks into your event with the same quality of attention. Not more because they're important. Not less because they aren't. The same. Because you don't know, and you won't know, and it doesn't matter. And the moment you start making that calculation, you've already failed at the actual job, she said. I have watched people get this wrong for 19 years. I've gotten it wrong myself. That's not an excuse. It's a starting point, she said. The room should look the same to everyone who walks into it. 12 people wrote that down. If this story stayed with you, if there's something in it you've seen in your own life, a room you were turned away from, or a moment you did the turning, share it in the comments. We read everyone. The truest version of this story isn't the one we told. It's the one you're carrying. Subscribe if you want more. We'll keep finding them. This is a fictional, dramatized story created for educational and inspirational purposes. Chris Hemsworth is portrayed in a fictional scenario consistent with his known public values of humility and quiet generosity. All supporting characters, businesses, events, and institutions in this story are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real persons other than Chris Hemsworth is coincidental. Narration is AI-assisted.